something. Is there any public input this time? No public input,
seeing
going
any.
once, going twice. At this point, have BDAB members reviewed the minutes from our last meeting, which I wasn't here.
Yes, I didn't see anything that needed to be changed.
Kevin? Kevin's the expert. He goes through with a fine tooth comb.
The minutes look good, Keith. I move approval of the minutes as presented.
Okay, do I hear a second?
A second.
Second from Brianna. All those in favor of accepting the minutes as printed, say aye.
Aye.
Jeremy's muted. Is that an aye, Jeremy?
That's an aye. Apologies.
Okay, approval of minutes has passed. At this point, we are going to talk about new chair elections.
Yeah, and as we kind of discussed, we're a little short on members today. Brianna has expressed an interest, but we'll probably have a second meeting in April on the 17th, just to kind of wrap up deliberation from this, get the folks that are stuck on planes coming back from spring break in the room. But if anyone's interested in vice chair, I can assure you, or chair, we can have a runoff for chair. I can assure you it's not too much work. Hopefully, Keith, you can back me up, write you a cheat sheet for the meetings. And yeah, we try to rotate members for participating in council discussions and the like as well. So if you have an interest, Jeremy, Gary, and Brianna, I think are the only members here that will continue to be on BDAB after June. So if any of you three have an interest, happy to chat. I'll send a follow-up email afterwards with all this info.
You're going to be senior members
Yeah.
already,
Right.
2 months in. So, and
Skip the.
we've typically, even though the terms are 3 years, we've rotated the chairman sometimes every year. I don't know what you'll do going forward, but so you'll get your chance.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, let's move forward to Colin's presentation with the
Actually,
permitting
Keith, so
fee.
I made an edit to the agenda this morning just
Oh,
because. and
sorry.
Gary and Brianna both and Kevin all participated in the advocacy or the developer discussions around fees. We thought it might be useful to talk a little bit about the transportation utility fee first and kind of the process for engagement on that. Because there's a lot of fee discussions going on right now. And so Sarah was going to go first, give a brief update and have an ask for the group and the folks that are watching this later in the recording. And then we'll get into the permitting fees.
Okay, great. Yeah, I see that on the update.
Okay. Sorry. All right. So I think we're just going to go pretty quickly, but wanted to talk today about the transportation fee. We've presented a couple council work sessions, so kind of want to bring the group up to speed. At the end of this, we're also going to be looking for a representative from BDAB to participate in some engagement as well. So that's kind of the ask we'll make, but want to lead it with some context and just make sure everyone's operating with the same information. So to start, I think Russ will just kind of go over some general funding context, and then we'll get into the specifics of what the transportation fee is. And then just to note that, all of this work around the transportation fee is a city council goal that we're moving forward.
All right, so I'll jump in here real fast. So Russ Grayson, Chief Operations Officer, and we could always come back and give you a full breakdown of kind of what our budget constraints are and issues, but I'm sure you've heard of them over and over on various levels and different things. But as we start to talk about the transportation fee, what we're really starting to describe is just our limited funding that we have coming into our general fund. As most people are aware, we have a second lowest tax rate in the state. The constraints on the general fund are significant. Most of the general fund comes from property taxes. Most of the money that goes to streets for operations and maintenance is coming out of the general fund. But as you can see on the chart, the left shows where that revenue is coming in from. And then on the right, it shows where it's going out. And you can see the majority of it actually goes to public safety, and then almost 80%. And then all the other functions within the city are scrambling and scrapping on that 20% of the rest of the fees to accomplish all the policy goals. So how the concept of this funding plan came about was through the transportation system plan that was done back in 2020. There was, for those of you that were around during that time, there was a significant amount of community involvement in that with an advisory committee and several subcommittees. One of them was a funding subcommittee, but is really trying to figure out what we want the transportation system to be designed to, how we want it to operate, but also there is a significant portion of time put into how we're going to fund it, not only just from capital, but all the other programmatic and operational needs that we are required for that system. So through that, just to kind of summarize what our problems are, we have a significant gap between kind of the desires and funding needs of the city and where we're actually at. There's about 120 million gap just in operations and maintenance. Our main funding sources are declining coming in. So gas tax revenue and money coming from both the state and federal level are limited. They've really dried up over the past couple decades. Obviously, there's an infusion of infrastructure funds coming at the federal level right now. That's one of Sarah's other tasks, is to try to chase those. We have several grant applications in. Hopefully we'll be successful in some of them, but it's not going to really fill a significant portion of the gap. And sorry, my laptop.
Your laptop is ringing?
It is ringing. Apologize for that. So, and we already have, as you drive around town, you know that we have a pretty big backlog of deferred maintenance already right now. Our main focus over the past 5-6 years has really been on the arterials and collectors. And those have come back up in a pretty good fashion in terms of kind of where we want them from maintenance. But our local road system, which is the majority of our system, there's a significant funding gap there. So here's just another quick graph that we want to show of the transportation funding needs through the planning horizon, which was 2040 coming out of the transportation system plan. It shows almost a need for about $1 billion worth of investment in operational needs. And I always like to throw that number out because when you think of a town of 100,000, that's a big dollar amount. And we have a funding gap of almost half of that right now that we're still trying to figure out how to fund. So the majority of our current revenue sources are coming in from the current allocations we get at both the federal and state level, as well as our current system development charges. And then we also passed a significant GEO bond in 2020, which is all part of the funding strategy as well. But you can still see over that 20-year horizon, there's still a significant gap in funding around our transportation system. So coming out of the funding group, there were several things that were talked about in terms of potential revenue sources. Some of them already exist, such as the general obligation bond. That was one of the recommendations that got passed. But then under discussion in terms of, and also from the amount of revenue that could be created, we're tackling the next two big ones right now between the transportation SDC increases that we're evaluating right now, as well as this transportation fee. Urban renewal funding is also starting to kick in, and some of that has been allocated to certain projects, especially in the core. But then you can see there's another level of funding tools that we'll probably be talking about in conjunction with this project a little bit, not actually taking formal action on them, but just trying to figure out all the different tools that we might want to use to fund our transportation system. There's been a lot of discussion around, well, how do you get the tourism dollars in here? We did try to pass a gas tax last decade. That did not go through. That may be something that is going to be discussed again with council, as well as things like targeted sales, food and beverage taxes as well, if you're trying to go after tourism dollars. There are options, but again, we're focused on the two ones that are kind of that gold color up at the top right now. And then we'll continue to have further discussions as we move through the biennium.
Right.
I mean, question?
Yeah.
2 questions. First, the 120 million over 20 years obviously averages to 6 million a year, but I mean, is it front loaded? I mean, you really need 20, 30 million now and,
No,
or is it pretty?
it's pretty spread out. What we're trying to do is kind of hit that 6 million, between 5.5, 6 million basically keeps our system where it's kind of at right now, and we don't continue to degrade. That's one of the policy questions we'll be asking council and working with them. It's like, where do we want to set that? Do we want to try to make, we use this term called pavement condition index, which is basically a scale of 1 to 100, on a grade book. What does your pavement look like? And so that's one of the things we'll be talking about. Are we just trying to, make sure that we don't depreciate even more, or are we trying to actually improve the system over time? But we want to do it consistently year on year on year. So it's not, of course, we would love to have, a $20 million infusion, but we don't need it in terms of the planning effort.
And the other question is, I know we can't use TRT tax, but is it legal to add something on additional onto lodging to pay, or would it have to be
I
fuel?
think Ben, and I don't know if legal's on the call, but
Yeah, so it is legal, but any new increment in our TRT that we pass, 70% would have to go to tourism promotion, 30% could go to the city's.
So we
general
can't,
fund.
we can't call something other than TRT if it's being collected by
That's right.
lodging?
Yeah, we can't call it a, special tourism tax or and those discussions continue to happen at the state level. I mean, there are cities that would love to raise their TRT or transient room tax and levy and have 70% more revenue or 70% of that revenue going to their tourism promotion. Other cities, Bend, Portland to some degree, some of the coastal cities that already see a lot of tourism want to see maybe a different split, but it hasn't risen up the agenda during this legislative session. to take
I
a
was
look at
just
that.
thinking if there was a way to add some sort of additional tax, now call it TRT. It's easier for lodgers, I would assume, to pay it in since they're already paying in, rather than creating taxes that businesses, have to get in the collect and start paying in, since lodging already does it.
Sure.
But if it becomes TRT, then probably a moot point.
and the last thing, what we're trying to also look at with this fee is there's basically 3 big buckets, which Sarah kind of talked about. It's one, operation maintenance funding. That's that $120 million gap, or around 6 million a year. Then there's also programs that have been outlined in the TSP around, think of bicycle programs or ped programs or things like that, that we currently it's recommended that we do in our TSP, but we don't have the funding or the staff to do it now. And then the third bucket would be capital. Do we want to use any revenue from the source to build any type of targeted infrastructure in our transportation system? Because we need funding in all 3 of those buckets.
To get a little bit more into the specifics of the transportation fee. So again, through that extensive engagement, they recommended a suite of funding tools, the transportation fee being the preferred funding tool, and that's what we're moving forward, although we're trying to have a holistic discussion around those other mechanisms as well. But the transportation fee specifically, the idea is that it treats the transportation system like a utility. So the mechanism by which we'd charge folks or collect this fee is it would show up on a utility bill. So it typically is a flat fee per month. Residents tend to get charged the way it works in other Oregon cities and other communities. Residents get charged one fee, businesses tend to get charged a different amount. The specifics of that would be under discussion, and that's part of the engagement process because there's a lot of flexibility in how you can kind of design that, but that's how it tends to look. So it's this regular fee assessed on the utility bill. It's often calculated using trip generation formulas. There's other ways to measure as well, but you're essentially trying to measure impact on the system. So everyone pays the fee. This is why it's a fee and not a tax. So it's based, everyone has to kind of pay into it. The use of funds is decided locally. As Russ talked about, I'll get into kind of the buckets that we had outlined, but in other communities, it's most often used for street preservation activities, but can also be used for capital, bike ped projects, things like that. A public vote is not required. Council has the authority to approve this fee, but they've made clear they really want to have an engagement process to help inform our thinking about what the framework of this fee would look like. On this slide is just a map of the other communities in Oregon that also have a transportation fee. They call it different things: transportation utility fee, street maintenance fee. It can go by different names. This is just an overview of where else it exists because of the different kind of the funding context that's present in Oregon. As I mentioned, the structure is determined locally, but there tends to be kind of a residential rate and a non-residential So in terms of why are we talking about this now beyond it being a goal? There's also there's a critical need for us to figure out sustainable funding for street preservation and maintenance activities. It becomes a more expensive problem when you kind of get to the point of streets required reconstruction. So we really want to kind of get into this preventative maintenance way of doing things. The maintenance backlog will only continue to grow if we don't kind of address this sustainable funding now. We're also looking at using funding for various near-term programs out of the transportation system plan that, within the plan, we were told these are things that we should be implementing sooner rather than later, but there's no funding source for it. There's also efficiencies in doing this work at the same time as a system development charge methodology update based on how the fees are structured, particularly on the commercial side. And there's also efficiencies to other city initiatives as well. Also want to go over, as I mentioned, we did go before council both February 15th and March 15th. At the February 15th work session, we talked about, can you provide us some guidance on the overall scope of what this fee should pay for? We got very clear direction that they do want to see this going to operations and maintenance funding because that is such a critical need. Also want to be exploring through the engagement process, funding some of these programs that the TSP outline as near-term priorities, and also potentially some capital, although that seemed to be maybe less of a priority. So we just kind of laid out those buckets and through the process, we'd kind of figure out what is kind of the community tolerance, because the more we do, the more expensive this fee would be. So where is that rate tolerance for what we'd be funding? So that kind of covers the scope. At the last work session, we kind of bucketed, these are the things that we've identified. These are the areas of questions we need to resolve. We're not going to put this on a utility bill overnight. It's going to take a while to figure out a number of things to even implement this. So these are the areas that we need to figure out how we're going to use the revenue, how would we structure the rate, considerations around equity, realizing there are a number of fee discussions circulating. So how do we kind of mitigate burden for our community members? Again, that rate tolerance piece. We also want to be talking about the other funding tools in conjunction. How can we kind of leverage the strong visitation Bend gets to also help fund our transportation system needs, things like that. So at that last meeting, we laid out here kind of 3 broad communication strategies. Because we don't technically need voter approval, we could do kind of a fast track path where we just determine that council's not interested in that. They do want to have that engagement piece. We decided we also don't need to necessarily do this very extensive work group process because we already did very extensive public engagement through the transportation system plan and that funding work group that we had mentioned previously. So we're kind of doing this middle of the road advisory group engagement, hence why we're here today, trying to get representatives from our various advisory bodies to help inform our thinking and decision-making around those various buckets that we need to figure out. So we got that direction from council to have the advisory group engagement, and where it would be most meaningful to get feedback would be, how do we want to use this revenue to help us determine how much we want to collect? What other funding tools do we want to explore as kind of next up as we talk about how to fund that gap? And then also questions around equity, rate tolerance, and then general accountability. So how do we go about showing with the community, just being transparent in the process of how do we create our project list and show how we're using those funds. So those are the types of things that we'd be exploring through this engagement. So just to kind of wrap it up, I kind of want to end on just a general timeline. So to date, we've done those council work sessions, and that's where we received the direction on scope and our engagement strategy. Right now we're in Q2. This is where we're really developing our work plan. We're going to go around to all the advisory bodies to get a representative. We're forming an internal work group as well. So really kind of laying out how we're going to be doing this work. In the next 3 to 6 months is when we're conducting these roundtables and really getting into the nitty-gritty of developing a rate structure and the ordinance. We're hoping to have another touch point with all the various advisory bodies between Q3 and Q4. With this timeline, we're looking at council having a decision point at the end of this year. And that would mean we're not even really looking at collecting fees until probably Q3 or summer of of next year would be like the most likely. So that's kind of the broad timeline. I know we went through things pretty fast. Are there any questions that we can answer right now?
Man, you mentioned that property taxes are the second lowest in the state, and I know that I've heard it many times, whatever. Have, but I don't think a lot of people understand that, and I think as you move forward with it, part of the outreach going to be, hey, this is because you pay lower taxes.
Yeah.
That we need to do other things, right? I mean, if you just compare to Redmond, I mean, isn't Redmond quite a bit higher for an equally valued house?
We actually have a couple slides, just we kind of cut them for length here, but yeah, we have in our normal, just, in our outreach, it's going to be around the kind of that general fund situation, our tax rate. But then also that how people view what their market value of their house is and what the assessed value, which are climbing at different because of Oregon tax rules, they're climbing at different rates.
Mhm.
Right. And so we're held to 3% kind of year on year on what the assessed value is, even though your house could be worth a lot more. So yes, that's all part of this. And then also there is a slide about, I think it's around 10 is a significant more amount of money if we had the same rate as Redmond.
Yeah.
That would be coming and we just don't. And so that's why we're having these discussions. So.
Yeah.
Kevin's got his hand raised on the screen.
So Russ, this may be a question directed at you. So we talked about the permit fees. There's a project on the SDCs, there's a new utility fee. Are you concerned about the capacity and or fatigue of the citizens of Bend to just pay that much more for government?
Yes, I would say, I mean, the unfortunate situation is if you look across the board, and this is going to come up during our budget deliberations as well, there's some serious budget issues the city needs to handle. Just like a lot of other people, we've been dealing with inflation. We've had personnel increases across the board as well. So that's all impacting kind of our city finances. And so that's going to be the topic of discussion from now until when that budget is adopted. And included in that is, we'll have these funding gap discussions. And then throughout the end of the year, then we'll figure out, well, then how do we want to deal with it? We're right in the middle of the SDC methodology, which we'll probably give a quick update here a little bit later on. The conversation that Colin is having around fee increases, these are not easy discussions and they are very serious discussions, but they're also just showing the existing financial condition of the city. We're being asked to do a lot of things. All of the federal money has dried up. All the ARPA dollars are gone. And so now we are still trying to figure out how to manage our business and all the things and policy directions that the council wants to do and the community is demanding.
Can I ask a follow-up question? That I think it was $4.5 million as the city's housing budget. Is that the portion that's funded by the affordable housing fee on new construction?
It's funded from a variety of different sources, and Kevin, I don't have all those numbers in front of me, but I can work with Ben, and if there's interest, we can definitely kind of have broader discussions around that. I mean, if there's interest in kind of what's going on with the budget, I think we can kind of get.
Well, I know that's a fee and a revenue source that Bend has that most other communities in Oregon don't have. Also an expenditure that Bend has that most communities in Oregon don't have, correct?
In terms of the housing?
For a while, that was the case. Most cities have kind of spun up their own housing divisions, but Bend, we kind of got in and grandfathered the initial construction excise tax before other cities could do it.
But there are definitely strains almost on every budget within the city right now, in terms of, just what we're dealing with in terms of kind of macroeconomics.
Will there be a holistic look at I've sat in on the permit one and these ones, and that's fine, but also understanding sort of what that total is when we're like, oh yeah, that sounds fine, but and then you say that to every one of them and you end up with this giant number at the end.
And Colin will talk a little bit about that. We understand there's a lot of moving pieces right now. And we're trying to provide as much transparency around that as we can. But I mean, because we're talking about the CDD fee increases, system development charges will most likely not go down. They will probably see an increase to the extent we don't know yet because we're working through those numbers. But we want to make sure that we understand the holistic impact to to a project, and that all this is going to, you know, there's also discussions around the affordable housing fee, construction excise tax. Because everything is being strained right now. So we want to make sure that it's a holistic understanding of what's going on. And that's one of the reasons when we talk about the SDC methodology, we decided not just to do the transportation, we decided let's do all transportation, water, and the implementation schedule on the sewer side. So there's a holistic look, because it really comes down to what's the check I'm writing to the city, right? And where does it, first is how much, and then usually the second question is like, where's all this going?
Thank you.
It's a self-solving problem, right? When it becomes prohibitive to build, then we won't need to pay for so much infrastructure and roads.
One way to.
Yeah,
that.
it's, and we can have very in-depth conversations around this because it is, I will tell you, it's a significant challenge for all the operational groups of the city to try to figure balance to this.
Yeah, and I think we wanted to talk about the tough first today, the transportation utility fee, because even in the discussions around fees, those discussions have started to move into, well, what about SDCs and a tough and other discussions that are probably coming down the road as well. But we have one kind of definitive decision point or opportunity for BDAB to weigh in right now, and that's fees, but the other ones are undefined.
And so we don't have an idea of what the potential end user impact of these fees. It's just a concept at this point. Are we talking about $5 a month per household? Are we talking about 50? What's the range of impact we could be looking at here?
Yeah, and that's one of the things we're gonna, one, what kind of revenue we want to create and what do we want to go towards? And then there's that financial impact. The only real kind of marker that we have right now was what was in the TSP, which Sarah, do you remember that often? Because I don't want to get it wrong.
I want to say it was $10 a month in the TSP.
Yeah, and it generated, I think, around 10 million,
Mm,
5 million.
Uh,
Generated about $10 a month, it generated about $5 million. But that was a very kind of high level kind of funding analysis that was done. And this is that deep dive into it. But I understand the concerns from everyone. I also wish that the demands that were being requested upon the city were also less, but they're not decreasing either. So that's why we want to have open and transparent conversations around all this, because these aren't fun, right? That is for sure.
So how do you prioritize? Do you have a map currently of like where the worst, like what the triage looks like from a need perspective, and the arterials or wherever, most potholed roads to the least, and like how you would approach it if you actually had the money to fix it? And when you look at, I guess, future impact, how does that change that decision, right? There's 300 units going at Jackstraw, there's 400 units, 500 units going that are going to feed into Reed Market and Columbia and those areas. Like how does that future impact look currently to you?
In terms of the impacts on the transportation system?
In
Or
terms of how it changes this dynamic of the ask for the dollars, right?
Yeah,
Because we
it-
know
Like
what
what
it
it
looks like
increased.
today, right? But there's a
there's a lot being,
there's a bunch of more impact coming, I guess, over the next couple of years, and they're really in very specific areas where I assume the roundabouts and things like that are funded through a different source.
funding comes from a variety of sources, but we've got 190.
This doesn't support things like that, I guess.
No, this is outside of kind of like,
It's just repaving and fixing potholes.
well, that's the first one. It's just repaving, and how do we want that? We're also building additional bike infrastructure. So how do we maintain those facilities? Because that requires different equipment to do that. If you start doing buffered bike lanes and things like that. Then there's also as the transportation system continues to evolve, these other multimodal programs are needed to help support, where do we want to direct those? Where's the need? Where are the gaps? Building out our bike and ped infrastructure. And then where, if we are going to create capital, do we want that targeted to go to certain parts of the transportation system over others with a specific fee? So
I think maybe to answer part of maybe what you're asking is in terms of how they prioritize
yeah,
what they're gonna do. And sometimes it doesn't seem to make as much sense, but sometimes you have to fix a road that looks much better than one because you want to maintain it, because it's gonna get destroyed. So it's better to spend money on something than to completely fix something else.
every year we go through it's a street saver. We work with a consultant. We go out and evaluate every road in the pavement condition condition index of every mile road that we have. And then with our limited budget, we've really been focused on keeping the good roads good. Because so if you can keep the roads that are in pretty good shape now good, then you don't have to completely rebuild them. We have a lot of roads that are beyond basic, street maintenance. They need to be fully repaired. So that's why you've seen a lot of work on the collectors and arterials, because those are the most kind of, in terms of moving goods and services around the city, those are the most critical roads. That local network's really bad, but they go through, and through that process, they prioritize every year where they're putting their dollars. And so now you're starting to see they're working into the neighborhoods, but it's more doing seal coats and things like that, not big reconstructions.
I guess part of my question is leading to where else are we short dollars relative to transportation? Right? If we know you're going to feed 300 more trips a day through a certain area, roundabouts can't handle, I would imagine that the roundabouts are getting at or beyond capacity in certain areas of the city to handle traffic the way that was designed to do, right? So, and this doesn't need to be answered, I guess, but it just, my brain goes to, we're sort of kicking the can a little bit down the road if we can pave and fix potholes, but there's a bigger issue, I guess, that I see that involves more infrastructure than that.
There's a significant capital need. Also, I would say the nature of the transportation system and the rules governing the transportation system are changing. So things are going to get more congested because there's certain rules in effect now that make widening roads a lot tougher. But in any case, we're always playing catch up. We've been playing because we're growing so fast. Even with this big geo bond that just got passed, there's still several $100 million after that of capital that is needed over that planning horizon just to build what's in our transportation system plan.
I know we're short on time here because
Okay.
Colin needs to run at 1:30.
Okay.
But Jeremy did unmute. If Jeremy, if you have a quick question, since you're the.
You have a question on this subject, Jeremy?
No, I didn't have a question that hasn't already been addressed in some manner. It kind of seems to me that no matter how this shakes out, you're going to need some kind of a sophisticated PR education program to help the residents of Bend and the business owners understand how certain taxes are ultimately going to be benefiting them. And somebody alluded or mentioned it earlier, we don't all understand the taxation, the way taxes work, right, in this town. And so sometimes that's what gets in the way of public approval or support. So that was my only comment on this. And I don't own a PR agency, so I'm not advocating that you go out and hire one that I own. It's just an observation from my experiences in the past with similar types of issues.
We're having that exact conversation right now as all these are starting to surface, how to frame that with the public. So it's hard enough to get the information out there in a way that is digestible when you have multiple things coming at you. How do you kind of blend?
Totally understand. Yeah, that is the biggest challenge.
This isn't a public approval process. This is city council has the.
City council, it's a vote of city council. So one of the requests that we have for this board is we'll be coming back to you as this proceeds as a full board, but we are also looking for a representative for these advisory groups as we start to bring people together to have additional conversations on if there's someone from BDAB that would be interested in joining that. We are looking for a name.
We may try to firm that up on the 17th,
Yeah.
just when we have everyone here. That works.
Well, we know about it. Every year we have 2,000 more people who don't understand how it all works. Oh, well, let's move on to the next one. Thanks a lot, Sarah and Russ. Colin, he's ready. Community Economic Development Department permitting fees.
Great, thank you very much. I'm Colin Stevens, Community and Economic Development Department Director, and some of you have sat through this at least once and maybe twice in the past. So I appreciate your attention, and based on the input that I've gotten at the other presentations, I've modified and added a couple slides. I've got probably over 20 with content to go through. So I'm going to try to go pretty quickly, but try to make sure we explain everything. Also, I have Teresa Briggs, who's the Community and Economic Development Department Business Manager, who knows our budget inside and out. And Jeanette Townsend is here as well. She's the Finance Director, who knows much more about the budget than anybody else in the city. Okay, great.
And-
So you get 10 seconds per slide.
Yeah. And I'll, for Kevin and Jeremy on the online, if you use the raise hand function. I'll keep an eye out for you both if you have questions.
And also for those online, I'm going to try to stay here, but for those who see me do this before, I'd also like to stand up and point actually at the screen. So my apologies there, but that's kind of how I operate. So permit fees, this is basically an agenda for what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about who we are as the Community and Economic Development Department, what we do, and what the fees are and why the fees are going up. So first slide. So who we are, we're 121 full-time equivalent employees. This is the number of employees we have approved in the budget. We don't always have 121 staffers fully staffed. And we'll talk a little bit about how that what the implications of that are on the budget. This coming year, for this next fiscal year, we have an 18.7 million budget for the entire department. And just to put things into perspective, in calendar year 2021, we processed 5,600 permit applications. And then this past calendar year, and I did calendar years because we already have full calendar years, because we're still a couple months into or left in our fiscal year with another 100 applications, so 5,700 applications. And then this is kind of to tail in on what was just discussed, how we're funded. 86% of that is fee funded, with another 14% coming from other revenues. We get a very small amount of that general fund that was talked about in the last presentation, and that mostly goes to our code enforcement staff and a little bit to our growth management folks. We also have some utilities that comes in for engineering, SDCs, some transportation and construction fund, core area, the TIF funding, the tax increment financing, and then a few state grants for other things like our MPO. So most of it's through fees, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So next slide. So what are permit fees? So I'm going to talk about what they are and then what they're not. And really what they are is just a way to pay for people. I don't buy fire trucks or Vector trucks. I pay people for the most part to provide services to the community. And those are engineers, inspectors, planners, building technicians, building inspectors, admin staff. So that's what they are. And they're also dedicated funds to the Community and Economic Development Department. So they stay in the department. And I'll talk about the three main funds that are impacted through this fee increase. That's building, planning, and engineering. I'll go through this in the next slides. What they're not SDCs. You just talked about SDCs. SDCs are a way to pay for projects that increase citywide infrastructure capacity. They're also not paid for maintenance like the TUF would do. So they're not discretionary funds to be directed to other city services. So you couldn't say, well, take those permit fees and go fill some potholes. It just doesn't work that way. They're not intended to produce a profit. We do try to structure them so that we do have a little bit of, we build reserves to a manageable amount. And then this is very important, and we'll talk about this through some of the other slides, because you'll see some charts that show what happens when the fees don't cover expenses. And if we run out of reserves, we're not backed by the general fund. So the general fund does not come in and write a little insurance policy when we run out of money and cover staff. So it's really bad when we run out of money. Next, why do the fees need to be increased? Mostly because our costs have gone up. Personnel costs, not only my department staff, but through the overhead, because we also help fund those departments that support the Community and Economic Development Department, like City Manager's Office, like our legal department, finance, et cetera. We have not taken fee increases over the 3 of the last 5 years. And even then, they've only been fairly minimal. We've had healthy reserves, and you'll see this as I move through the future slides, that we intentionally spent down probably a little bit too aggressively, but that's another reason. And then also, this is a want. This is not a want, but it is a need. We're only adding 1 new FTE to the entire department, to that 121 FTE for the entire biennium, so for 2 years. So it's really just to keep the existing staff and to not lose ground on the improvements that we made for turnaround times for permitting. So now I'm going to go through the first of 3 different funds, and we divide the funds out by the divisions. So I'm going to go through the building division fund first. So next slide. And I'll take a little bit more time with this slide than I will with the next ones, just because I want everybody to have a full understanding of what this bar represents. So the very bottom of it, the darker, this is the lighter blue, represents the staff. It's the personnel that we're paying. So this is basically everything that's in their paycheck is in that bottom part. The next bar or the next color in the bar up is materials and services, M&S. So that's everything that is needed to support those staffers or is being spent out of that fund, but particular to that, the activity of that division. So in the M&S within the building mostly goes to training. And actually, I think the bulk of that M&S is for our third-party reviewers because that's a contract that we actually set that money aside and then pay the third-party reviewers, but it has to live in our M&S section of their budget. But then it has things like training, certifications. We did not purchase any vehicles, even though we have quite a few vehicles for the building inspectors. We're moving, they had low enough mileage, we're moving them past this biennium into the next for replacements. And we have department overhead, that's the yellow bar, and that's the sort of administrative staff that need to support not only this division, but all the other divisions within the department. So I'm in that yellow section because I'm part of the department overhead. And then we have the citywide overhead. So we've broken up citywide and department overhead into two. Same idea for the citywide overhead though, but it's folks outside of our department who are needed to support the entire department. Like Russ and Jeff are in the citywide overhead. Our city attorneys in there. The rent for City Hall is within that. So it's costs that we incur just to do business. Any questions on this one?
I do. So this is a little over 11 million, a little over 12 million. And,
Well, this doesn't have dollars. Oh, I see. Yeah, if you add them up.
didn't you say the whole budget was like 18 million?
This is just for the building division. We actually have like 9 different divisions.
Oh, the other was the
programs within
whole
the entire
CE.
department.
Okay.
The 3 largest divisions are planning, building, and engineering, and that's where all the permit fees reside.
Okay. Yeah. Got it.
All right, next slide. So here's where I'm going to stand up because it's easier for me to explain it. So this represents what's happening today. This does not have any fee increases in it. This is just what's been happening since 2019, moving forward, projecting through to the final year of the biennium. So that's what each one of these represents a year. This next number up is the fee increases over those years. We're showing zeros in for the projecting out years just because this shows if we don't do anything. So there was a 3% increase back in 2020, a 3% increase a year ago in 2022 for last biennium. What these next numbers up represent are the number of staffers in that division, and we had 121 that are approved. So out of that, 44 of them are in the building division. The ones with the asterisk, these are years that have happened in the past and closed out the years and balanced the books. So that's essentially what we did is we just did, okay, how many, if you just took FTE and divided how much we spent on staff, how many we actually had full for that entire year. And then if it doesn't have an asterisk, that's we're projecting forward that that's how many we have budgeted in the budget. But since we don't know how many we're actually going to have, we're projecting that the full number of 44 today. Then as far as the lines are concerned, the darker one represents revenue. As you can see, our revenue exceeded our expenditures really twice in the past or since 2019. Once was in 2019. We did not exceed, we ate into, or we didn't clear our expenditures in 2020, 2021. Volume increased in 2022. So we were actually, did pretty well with volumes, even though fees only increased 3%. Now we're back to a pretty flat projection for revenues. The lighter line is our reserves. And what that shows is how we divide our reserves into a number of months. We represent how many months of operating expenditures are in our reserves. So very healthy back here at 24 months. Again, at 21, well over up to 18 months. And the way we like to operate, standard operating procedure for reserves is between 12 and 18 months. So all the way really from our existing year that we're in, we're right here in this year. Up until this year, we were pretty healthy, well above where we like to be within the 12 to 18 months, even above that. Our fiscal policy is to not drop below 6 months of reserve. And as you can see over here, for next year, we're projecting 6 months. Second year of the biennium, we're down to 1 month. So this is. Any questions on this one?
How many current staff do you have?
This one should rectify out pretty good. What are you projecting now?
We have about 3 vacancies right now in building, but we also have 2 part-timers, so we're kind of short a little over 2 FTE.
I'd say it's probably between 41 and 42 is how that'll close out.
And we've had significant staff turnover over the past 3 years, which is related to some of the issues that we've been talking around on. And now we're
Turnaround
finally we're almost fully staffed for the first time in years.
All right, let's move on. So we are in the midst of a fee analysis. So we're really taking a deep dive into it, and what we've determined, and just got our budget numbers. It's been several weeks ago. But based on that analysis, the next slide then shows what we would need to do in order to come out into full cost recovery in year 1. So the first year of the biennium, which would be next year, in order for us to get back up here in the black. This doesn't quite represent it, but up here where our revenues are meeting our expenditures, it would take a 60% increase that first year, and then a 10 and 10 and 10 for the next year, and then we're even projecting out even into the next biennium with 2 more 10% increases. And we understand that that's too much to ask for in the first year. So what we're actually going to do, and what we're proposing, is to phase that in so that we go here to a 20% this coming year, another 20% for the second year of the biennium, and then project out another 20 and a 10 for 2026 and 2027. And you can see this, the colors of the revenue and the colors for the reserves are the same. So this does take revenue up. We're still eating into reserves. This is this year. So this would be the next year. We're still eating into reserves, but the curves are starting to go, or the lines are starting to go in the right direction. So the revenues are going up, so that we're projecting we're daylighting out at the end of the second biennium. So this is a long phase, and it's going to go over 2 budget cycles, 4 years. And then also we're turning the curve up on reserves. Because remember, go back to the last slide.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You remember when this goes off the chart, there's no general fund. So that's bad. We need to cut expenditures and then we cut expenditures. Cutting what we pay for, that's people. So go back to where it was. Okay, so we are turning this back up, but you'll notice that even in the out years, and this is we're projecting out with some pretty conservative numbers, but this is showing in our out years that we're going below that 6 months, so we will be changing our fiscal policy to allow us to do that in order to make this work. That's because I'm going to move on to the next one.
Well, then does this take into consideration building any reserves? I mean, if you're basically at break even there in 27, and then you're going to remain at that 4-month reserve for.
That's a very good observation and a good question. So what we're doing, we're actually just adopting fees for 1 year. It would be for this upcoming year. And then we're going to monitor it. We're doing this from here this way as a way to saying, okay, this is a good idea. We think this is, is good fiscal policy in order to move this direction. It balances raising the fees to the lowest extent we can, but still kind of turn the curve up. We're still projecting at 44. That's full FTE. It's very rarely that we carry a full complement of FTE. Usually, people come and go. So that may go down 5 or 10%. So any savings there would go right into reserves. Also, we're projecting our activity levels fairly flat with some increase, but not a drastic increase. So anything that we would see that would take that upward would also help build reserves. So again, we're going to monitor this. Hopefully we don't ever have to go below that 6 months and would gain, but we'll keep an eye out.
You're saying from a revenue perspective, a growth perspective, you're predicting that to be flat?
2.3%, not in this upcoming fiscal year, but the next fiscal year. And because it's so speculative in those prior years, we did move flat for the future. It is something we can go with again.
We're talking about permit processing as your activity source of business and revenues. 2.3%. So how does that factor in for the past 3 or 4 years? Like, what has it been?
I'd have to go back and do a little bit more untangling of the increase from.
I was talking about activity,
Yeah.
permit activity.
It's lower than past years. During COVID, we did go flat.
Go back 3 slides.
But
We had a bump, whoops,
There you go.
we had a bump in 2022. As you can see, it's been fairly flat.
But if you go back even further, you'll see a continual increase, you know, because we were booming before COVID. COVID was a full stop, then it kind of, as you know, bounced back with a vengeance. Just in this current macroeconomic climate, the crystal ball is extremely fuzzy right now. And that's one of the things we've been working on is like, where do we set that, knowing we're gonna have to continually monitor and update. We got to show something in the multi-year projections.
What is the measurement? Is it number of permits or dollar value of permits?
It's gonna give us a better picture because each permit can cost something different. So just using the permit count, we have looked at that. And the actual count has gone down. But it's also not a good predictor because you could have a one-to-one that are totally different values. And so, and when you're talking
Yeah,
about thousands of that.
Completely get that. It just surprises me that the graph shows activity going down from 22 to 23, or maybe it's because just use like a project like Jack.
It has been. We've seen it drop since.
So Teresa and Russ, can I ask you a favor? Can you sit up here? Getting texts
Yes.
like crazy right now.
So we have seen
Oh,
it
you're fine,
drop
you're fine.
over the past 6 months to a year. 22 was crazy. And that's where we were scrambling, staffing, all the issues we were having. Finally stabilized now. And so now we're really trying to see, we know that a lot of people, as I'm sure you know, Gary, I mean, a lot of people want to pop buildings. There's a lot of drivers right now trying to figure out if they can or not. And so we're all playing crystal ball. That's why, as Colin, we're presenting something that's kind of in the middle of, we're not going to take the needle all the way up to what the fee study is saying, but it's what we want to do is just evaluate revenue and expenditures quarter on quarter and continue to have these conversations around what things are looking like.
All right, we're going to move on, and I would like to recognize that Janet, Finance Director, needs to leave in about 5 minutes. If there's any sort of larger questions about our budget, or decision-making or overhead, that would be a good time.
On personnel, even though the headcount is flat, you're assuming about a 10% annual increase, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, just to put in perspective, so we just renegotiated we have 3 bargaining units. We negotiated all those agreements, and basically it's a 10% wage increase that was done. Plus there's additional personnel costs, as everyone can imagine, through insurance and state requirements and everything else. So, I mean, that's where, when we were starting to talk about fees and fee increases, well, when with inflationary pressures and everything, we have just a personnel increase of 10%. That's almost the foundation we're talking about, because it's every business we've had to adjust for the market for retention and recruitment purposes as well.
The overhead seems to be going up pretty significantly from 22 to 24, both department and citywide. What's driving that?
Same, a lot of it's person, if you want to go on this, but I can give, it's basically personnel cost and also things that we're being asked to do by programs and policies.
Just give you 2 minutes.
And it may, if you want a broader conversation, we may want to schedule something later to come back and have Jeanette kind of give a more holistic presentation, but just like every other business inflationary cost, operational cost of fuel, cost of equipment, everything has gone up.
And I think as questions come up through this presentation, knowing Jeanette has to leave in like 2 minutes,
I
we
think
can
it's
park
a
some of
pretty
those for the
complex
17th.
equation, and I think ultimately there needs to be some more transparency into like some of the background in these things, just to have a better understanding what it is. I think this meeting's not long enough to dig in there, so I could definitely see a more intensive meeting that would dig into more of the details of it. for
Yeah,
sure.
and we've got 2 or 3 days of budget deliberations with the budget committee scheduled in May. And so that's really where, when you start talking about the overall finances of the city, that's really where that macro conversation is occurring. But we'd be more than happy to bring back information, or at least provide context of kind of what's going on and where the money's going.
And what's the timeline for the fee increase? when would you put it in effect?
July 1.
It would be, it's
Fiscal
part,
year.
it's part of that, of our biennial budget process. And so the budget gets adopted, new fees get adopted along with that, and they would go into effect July 1st.
And this is also a city council
Yes,
approval.
yep, city council action.
And to be clear here, because Colin mentioned it, going back to this, that would be the FY 24 increase as proposed here.
Yeah,
And it's for the
20%.
same for
Mhm.
all the divisions. The other ones would come in future fee
Right.
schedule.
And I think for, as Colin alluded to, the most important number there is that FY 24 fee increase, because that's really what we're really looking for approval on. And then we just have to show how we maintain budget compliance in the out years at this point, not kind of waiting for the crystal ball to become a little clearer.
Kevin has his hand raised online.
Thank you. Russ, did you say that you negotiated with the bargaining units 10% increases? Is that an annual increase over the life of the agreement, or how many years are we committed to 10% based on 1 year of high inflation?
Hi, Jeanette Townsend, Finance Director.
Oh.
Hi, so the bargaining unit, each of the 3 bargaining units are 3-year agreements. So they ran from July of 2022 to June of 2025. Am I doing that right?
Thanks. So.
Yeah, so it's the end of our biennium, it lines up with the end of our biennium. And so the increase was largest in that first year. So effective in June of essentially June, July of last year, when those got negotiated. And then there are scheduled out increases in each of the years, each of the following 2 years. So there's each agreement's 3 years total. The 10% was largely in 2022. There's increases in 2023 and 2024 scheduled in each of those contracts that aren't at 10. They're different for each contract, but they're in, kind of the 5 to 8% range, depending on kind of which contract and kind of exactly where an employee might be sitting in a scale, those kinds of things. So it's fairly complex, and we have that all modeled out at a person level. We do our budgeting at a person level. And that has fed into the numbers that you're seeing here. So we do forecast that out specifically based upon those bargaining unit agreements, and then what we expect for our non-represented.
Thank you. Is that 10% in addition to any COLAs that are specified by contract, or is that a net of the COLA?
Yeah, that included COLA as well as merit in the last year.
Okay, thank you.
Going forward also has a COLA and a merit component, again, depending on the contract, depending on, they're all three are different, as well as our non-represented. But we take what those exact are and then model it down to a person and position level. And then roll it all back up into the numbers that you're seeing here.
Thank you.
There was a letter from COBA that outlined a lot of what was discussed in the last one of these that I sat in. I don't know that any of them specifically were answered, but is that somewhere later?
We have not put a formal response back to that yet, but I mean, and we're more than willing to be transparent on our books and where it's going as Jeanette said. I mean, we've got it by person and then how all the overheads are allocated. Just hypothetically, even if you removed those couple things that they're asking for, you're still not really significantly changing the conversation that we're having, right? I mean, you can say, why is this position allocated that much? But holistically, we've got a significant gap that we need to figure out what to do. You can kind of trim around the edges, but it's really not going to make a substantial impact in terms of the big question that we're trying to get across right now. But we'll get more information to them on their questions.
All right, let's go to the planning fund. That's next. So here with the planning, very similar to what we just talked about. With building, we're just talking just fewer people and about half the number of people have the budget. So the bulk of it goes to planning staff with similar M&S materials and services. The bulk of the planning's materials and services goes to our mailing service. We have a contract mailer because the planning division has to send out legal notice for all of the land use decisions, because that's where the due process for development takes place. So that's where most of their M&S is, and then we've got department overhead and city audit, already just talked about. And we'll go to the storyline for the planning fund, and honestly, the planning fund is the worst out of the three. And everything else is very similar. Starting from the bottom, took a 3% in 2020, and there was a little bit of a higher one in 2022. Theirs was 5.5% with building and engineering, but 3% there. That's been it. Hovering around between a low of 15 FTE. That's when we actually eliminated some positions, or we eliminated the ability to fill positions because we didn't know what was going to happen in COVID, and so we held them open, and then we had trouble filling them, and so actually our revenues went up pretty low here, but we kind of balanced that on the backs of the planners that were pretty granted permits out. Another thing to understand about the planning fund was back in the early 2000s, probably 10 years ago. There was a decision to direct some general fund money to the planning fund to help support the front counter, to support our pre-application meetings, and also to help with our code amendments that we do to help implement city council policies. Just based on the reserves back in, I think it was about 2018, healthy reserves, and then that pressure that's on the general fund that we've heard quite a bit about. That funding was removed from the planning fund, but the fees were never really increased significantly to fill that gap. And so that's a lot of the reason that they're going down so precipitously. But in all the other numbers are the same. Here's our revenue. Which is looking kind of like the building one, fairly flat peak there. But this is what's really concerning is our reserves. So we're right here right now. This is a year from now, and we're off the bottom probably in July or August of next summer. Not this coming summer, but the summer of 2024. So this one really paints a picture of needing to do some action very soon.
And just as we talk about review times and the struggles with that, one thing to point out, just in terms of kind of what the structural problem is, planning has been hitting their marks. There are statutory requirements that planning has to hit. The planning review times have held through this entire period. As Colin said, on the backs of the planners as we were trying to recruit staff. So that group is balanced and is performing at kind of our desired framework, but we also have, as you can tell, significant structural financial problems that are going along with the fee increases.
One of the things that might just help from a communication standpoint or explaining it is looking at each of the buckets and what things can you control and what things can't you control. Assuming that you have employees and those things, but then when you look at, I don't know, the M&S fund, is there things that you'd like to buy, but you don't have to buy, those type of things. And just being able to articulate that in a way that starts to give flexibility and assuming that permits maintain and that you're still doing the same type of business, but you're able to also conserve or control the budget in a maybe a leaner way. Or are you looking at other ways of doing processes that start to streamline it that then affect other buckets? And I think having those just conversations might help explain why. Or that there's due diligence, I guess.
So next slide. So again, this is if we just increase the cost of service year one. But just like building, it'd be 60% that first year and then going out with tens. But we get the lines going in the right direction and do that early on. So similar thing with this fund, we are proposing a phase in. The next slide.
And I just want to real quick on reserves. The reason we want to have reserves is a couple things. One, just to weather economic climates, right? But also remember, we get paid up front to also perform a service. So on a building application, we get paid the fees up front. And then as that building's in construction, we still need to send people over the next year out there as that building goes up. So that's another reason to have those reserves is we still got to make sure that we can actually perform the work and we have the staff to perform the work.
So this is the phased in approach for planning. We're doing a 30 the first year, a 30 the second year, and a 10 and a 10. And as you can see, it gets our revenues going in the right direction to the point where we're actually clearing or about hitting our expenditures by the end of the biennium. But we're skimming the treetops on our reserves. We're really taking that down. We talked about how conservative our assumptions are here. So if anything, these might go up a little bit, but just showing really next year, where I think our numbers are about as tight as we can get them. We're going to be dropping down to that 4-month range, which is below our 6-month reserve. And we're hoping that things will turn up without having to do anything other than that.
We talked last week about some of these slides and how conservative they are.
Mhm.
I guess I would rather see it as a range, you know, of like where you see like actual versus the conservative approach.
Mhm.
Just from a business perspective, it would be good to understand that there's some potential daylight, right? More than anything, that those reserves could in fact increase at a higher rate. And I
Mhm.
think that would help send a little bit better message to people looking at this. If you could see, you know, you're saying maybe not worst case scenario, but hopefully on the conservative side,
Right.
but you know, if there was another line added to say, if we looked at it this way, there's actually some more daylight out in 26, 27 to replenish the reserves.
And I took that input. I thought it was really good. Talked with Teresa about that. She's got some slides already developed. They were just not ready for today.
And this may be useful to tee up now. I mean, I've spoken with Travis and Russ and Colin around Travis Davis, the BDAB chair, around kind of quarterly updates on permit turnaround times. But I mean, you're seeing kind of a static look right now that we know is going to change probably on a quarterly basis going forward based on all sorts of different conditions. A portion of your feedback to council could be around, hey, we want to make sure as these discussions go forward, we aren't getting the next one in, what year is it? Yeah, in April of 2025, but instead kind of building that capacity on BDAB and watching the trends, right? So when we're having that FY25 discussion, maybe your feedback to council is, hey, we thought it was going to be 30%, but actually based on how things are moving, it makes more sense for it to be X,
100%.
right?
I mean, we want to support the discussion, and the only way to do that is to be somewhat proactive. So in the next couple of quarters, if you see that trend going up, it's like, okay, great, you know, then your assumptions were good and we can, you know, stand behind it. It's just it's a little fuzzy, I guess, right now, looking at and trying to get a grasp on it. You know, this is my first time ever seeing any of this detail, so it just would be helpful from a support perspective to dig in a little deeper.
I think it's important. The hardest, and I respect that comment, because the hardest thing to do is like, we are also working in like a budgetary compliance, you know, at a level where we need to show certain things, and those are the numbers that get us there. But we also know, well, we're kind of built on a lot of assumptions here, and we really need to see how the market reacts and what our options are. So it's not a one and done conversation, but trying to match between what we need to show in budget documents with kind of then how we actually want to handle it on a quarter by quarter basis. A little bit different story there.
Your next opportunity to actually do an increase again is when?
In theory, we could do an increase at any time, but we typically try to look at, like, the next big look we would do would be for the July 1st of this year. Then we usually do a mid-biennium tune-up. You know, in theory, we look at everything every 6 months. You can bring a budget adjustment forward at any time, but usually the big tune-ups are kind of in that mid-biennium. So it'd be July of next year, June, July of next year.
All right, let's keep going. So private development engineering, this one's actually in the best of the three, even though it's not in the greatest of shape. So let's go forward. And the bulk of the fund covers the engineering staff. Our M&S is pretty low there, about 100,000. Department overhead and citywide overhead. I don't think I need to explain those again. And then just the sort of current state of affairs with engineering. I've got an interesting arc there. As you can see, the revenues have actually been pretty high, mostly because their staffing was really low. We had a lot of turnover here. This represents the actual staffing expenditures. We had open positions that we've been able to fill, and now we're actually to a point where we're pretty comfortable with the number of staff that we have, and they're pretty trained up, and our turnaround times are showing. Our turnaround times are pretty bad back here, but they're starting to look a lot better. And I've got a slide that demonstrates or some data that I pulled from today and got that later on. But they run into a similar situation as the other two funds, but they're in further out. And so they really don't turn upside down to the point where we're right at that 6 months of reserves until we get to the second year of the biennium, 2025. So we still need to take action with this fund, but it's not as dramatic. So the next slide. So this would be the taking us straight up to the cost of service. The full cost recovery the first year would be a 30%, followed by a 6, an 8, and an 8. And similar to the other two funds, next slide, we're proposing to phase that in with just 10s for each of the upcoming biennia years in the biennium. So 10% in 2024, and then in 2025 is the end of the biennium. But it gets those lines going in the right direction. This one's still trending downward, but we've already talked about the fairly conservative assumptions that we're making for those years.
Again, I mean, I think from a business perspective, the graph still looks bad. Right? I mean, there's got to be daylight somewhere in the future to solve the problem. And so this, hopefully that if you back off the conservative and there's an added line to show potential daylight,
Yeah.
at least there's something there.
The toughest thing is we're basic, because we get no general fund support. We're basically asked to run like a business, but we have no control over our business, right? We're really reacting to what comes in the door. And so there's a lot of, as you can imagine, there's a lot of assumptions built on assumptions on how this works, and we will constantly monitor it.
All right, let's keep rolling. I've got a few other very important things to cover. So 2 other fee increases. There is what's called a long-range planning surcharge that's put on all planning and engineering fees. This helps to go pay for our growth management folks who do all of our long-range planning, mostly associated with the comprehensive plan, expanding the UGB. We're dealing with the climate-friendly and equitable communities rulemaking that they're very entrenched in right now. So right now that fee is 4%, and that's going to go to 10%. So that gets added on once all the fees are calculated. You put, right now it's 4% on top, and then it's going to be a 10% on top of that. And then for licensing fees, I'm not going to go any details on this, but we do licensing. That's one of the divisions that we have. Those fees right now, for the most part, don't cover the full cost of service. And so we're moving those forward. We're increasing those to meet that policy objective. We're not going all the way up, but we're going up to what we think is palatable by the folks who actually do licensing or get licenses from the city.
Short-term rental, marijuana, transportation services like Uber, Lyft, noise variances, those type of and there's slight increases to business registration.
Business registration, which we'll talk about later in the agenda. So
What is I know that the theme has been to what's palatable to the community, what can we raise it? What's the concern if you just said, I want to go all in? Like what was the reason that you guys didn't propose that?
Or just the licensing?
Or just all the fees?
All of it.
It's the optics of it. I mean,
It's not going to be
Don't do a
palatable.
I mean, yeah, it sounds bad, but a lot of things in the economy sound terrible. Doesn't stop
Yeah, and
everybody else from doing. business.
we're trying to balance those forces, right? One, we don't have a clear crystal ball on exactly what's going on, right? So what you see, the first year's changes are like, that's a structural change that we believe we need just to get us on the right course. With all the variable, just overhead costs and things that have personnel costs and just increased costs. Nothing's getting easier as well, right? If you look at the state, I mean, one of the reasons that planning fees going up for long range planning is what we're being asked to do at a state level is only getting more difficult. And so again, trying to just balance all these different things, and also I'm trying to make sure that we're palatable and we understand, projects right now are kind of margin thin, they're razor thin margins that they're trying to analyze. So we understand the impacts of these decisions that they have on the community. So.
And this might be, I know what would happen to my own business if I chose to work in the red all the time. But what happens to the city? Do you just wait for federal or state funds to
No.
come back in, or do you close shop? Like, what's the worst case scenario?
We'd be looking at standard cost reductions like any other business. And as Colin said, I mean, that's personnel. And so the other thing we want to say is the other reason we want to make sure that we keep our staff here is even if things slow down, because this happened coming out of the recession, we were markedly understaffed. I arrived at the bottom in 2011 and came all the way out with it. And we didn't catch up until probably 2016, 2017 in terms of our staffing. And so that's the other reason to have those reserves there, is because we can't weather, a long multi-year thing. But if we have slight hiccups, you want to have that experienced staff here. So when the market does turn, and it usually turns very quickly in Bend, that we have staff there to be able to respond and move things forward and get permits out the door. So again, trying to find that happy balance of all those different factors. That's what we've been trying to do.
All right, let's go to some project examples. I'm sorry. Move some slides around. So I just wanted to compare what we have done with our funds as far as fee increases, and I showed those numbers at the bottom, so those bar graphs. This is what we've shown for increases. There's 3% across for building, planning, and engineering in 2020. In 2022, planning took an 8.5% increase, and the building and engineering funds took another 3% for a total of 6%. So that's what we've done since 2018. Planning is 8.5%, building and engineering at 6%. This is comparing them to the Western Region Cost Consumer Price Index, which, as you can see, we have not been tracking that. We've sort of followed it through here, but certainly it really diverged strongly. I mean, honestly, if we had been more aggressive and just following that along, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be having a conversation, but it's not to the extent that we are today.
But we also felt if we would have come back 2 years ago when we were sitting on
Yeah.
18-month reserves and said we need to do a 10% fee increase, we probably would have been asked to leave the door.
Yeah.
Right. So that's trying to balance all those things.
And then this next one's an interesting slide, and just through I think this was the Beacon report. And, oh, sorry. Which shows
Jump on too
those
much.
two, or those 3 lines essentially are the city's fee increases, the consumer price index shown with what's happened with the cost of single family dwelling and median cost. And so, as you can see, this is a cost, essentially cost of labor, cost of materials and stuff. Really hasn't kept pace with the cost of housing. Obviously inputs on the cost of housing, but they're not direct influencers on the supply and demand and the price equilibrium that eventually ends up with that number. We are conscientious about that, but it's really, I think that slide's says a lot. So what does that mean for real projects? Let's go to the first one, and this is the one most people talk about, and that's the cost of a single family dwelling. We call it single unit residential now. I pulled a number this morning, looked like 660 is about the median price that just finished March with. Right now, the city's permit fees are about $6,000 with these projected increases for planning, building, and engineering. I would take it up to about $7,450 with a difference of about $1,300. We are plugging in, because I did want to show what the true cost or the full cost to a city cost to a permit would be, because we pay SDCs, we charge SDCs at the same time that people pick up their permit. We plugged in a 3% increase. We anticipate that's going to go up later in the year, but it will likely go up 3% on July 1. We also did a 3% increase on the water meter and the affordable housing fee for a complete difference of $2,424 for a single family dwelling. This is an actual house. We pulled a permit and ran the numbers on it. It's 2278 square foot house. It had about a 450 square foot garage. So if you just look at the CEDD permit, so that top line, not looking at SDCs or the other fees, right now, on that 660,000 square foot or median house, the CEDD fees represent about 9% or 0.9% of that full price, and it would go up to 1.1. So we're talking about a 1% of the median price just in CEDD fees. And if you add it all together to add in the SDCs, including parks SDCs, as well as the water meter and the affordable housing fee, all permits would be about 5.9%. So very similar to a real estate commission. And this gets charged once. Next slide. So this would be multi-unit residential. So this is an 8-plex, eight residential units. Currently, the permit fees for CEDD would be about $14,000. They would go up to a little bit more than $17,000. Made some assumptions for SDCs and as well as the other fees. So this, based on an actual project, which the valuation on this one was about $875,000. The CEDD permit fees are the new ones would be about 2% evaluation. up from 6.1% of the valuation. And in reality, the per unit fee increase is about $408 per unit. 408 times 8. Keep going. For a 19,000 square foot new commercial building. This one, the valuation was 8.97 million. So the existing permit fees are 145, about 146,000. They would go up to 173.6. And then again, we made some assumptions for the persistence development charges and other fees that you can see there. But on this actual project, you can see to put this into perspective. The new CEDD fees would be about 1.9% evaluation, which would be up from 1.6%. So just kind of across the board for those larger multifamily and commercial, we're hovering around 2% evaluation for the CEDD fees. And for the single family residential would be about 1%. Up or down, kind of depends on where valuation lands or the median home price lands. And then I put in, and my final example would be for an ADU. You can't, there's not like a median home price for an ADU. So I don't really have any perspective on this one, but this shows what the effects would be on an ADU. The permit fees for CEDD would go up about $865 bucks.
And I think in the other one, we had talked about adjusting the SDC charges because we, like, even though this is saying 3%, the assumption is that it will be more than that. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
It
I
will
just
be,
don't know what it is.
and we're evaluating a lot in that SDC discussion, which we'll probably table for another day. But yeah, in terms of trying to figure out how to allocate it different size units and structures and things.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure everybody.
SDCs
I
will
know.
most
Yeah.
likely have some additional increase as we go through the methodology,
Um,
which goes back to the transportation funding discussion that we previously had, right? So I wish I had better news.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to hear suggestions on that one. I mean, one idea would be just take it out, but I don't want to do that because I'd like to have everything in there that really is associated with the city fee. So I'm just leaving it as a 3% and explaining that that's what we're putting in because that's probably what's going to be July 1 with the understanding that it's going to go up and later on in the year. And I don't even know what the Parks District SDC is going to look like. for this
That we
year.
just want to, in most projects, the significant part of the city fees are SDCs of that check that you're writing to the city.
And I guess my suggestion would be to err, I guess, on the conservative side, which would technically be the higher side.
Right.
So changing it to a higher number rather than a lower number, because then it would be, if it comes down, everybody's happy. If it increases, everybody's mad.
Right. True. All right, next slide. Oh, sorry.
Just from a global perspective, you go back one slide.
Oops, sorry, Jim.
So the permit fees line, when you add up when you add all of those numbers for 5,700 applications, is that what's covering the $18.7 million total budget?
Well, I mean, it's more complicated than that. I mean, each one of those permits, one could be like a commercial building permit for a 300 unit building, or it could be an ADU. So it's kind of, it's
I
pretty
understand, I'm
broad.
just trying to, in terms of matching revenues with the expenses, is that permit fees line, we got 3 different types that we look at here, and I'm sure there's a million other kind of permits, but when you add up, if you had X number of each of those, and you add them all together, that's what needs to cover the 18.7?
86% of that first or second slide that I showed. Well, go ahead, Teresa.
Just to clarify, that 18.7 was just the personnel budget. We were showing FTE, 18.7 is personnel. That's not the
That's only
total,
personnel,
yeah,
that's
that was
not
not the
total.
total budget. So if you're trying to do math on that,
Personnel was like 52 or something like 2% of the total.
roughly of these 3 funds, we were showing that first slide is full department, so it includes 6 or 7 other funds that aren't these.
And I will say, because you usually get a question, yes, we're usually higher than other markets. That is because other markets typically have some general fund support that comes into them. Since we are almost 100% fee supported, that's why our fees are at the rate they are, which is not typical with many other cities.
So I added a couple slides since the last presentation because every time I've talked about this before, turnaround times comes up and it makes perfect sense that it comes up because the two are very related. These are the folks that process permits. We're asking for more money to do that. And we want to demonstrate that we're at least being efficient if we're not making things even better than they have been. And so I put these slides in to talk about a different sort of project that I've been working on, and that's to improve turnaround times. And I have a presentation coming to City Council at their quarterly update on the 19th of this month. So I'm preparing for that, but I'll give a little sneak peek here. We did back in December, had some meetings with our partner people who work in the development industry who actually compile the permits. So civil engineers, commercial building permit designers, and to talk about what we could do to do things better. And we came out with some initiatives that we're implementing right now. I just threw them up here so that this group could see what we're doing. A lot of them being implemented this month. We're actually seeing some results of that. And I'll do that on the next slide. I'll give just people an opportunity to read this if there are questions. Or go back to the last one first. Sorry. I'm not going to read through these, but I've just put up building division and engineering division because those are the ones where we've had our biggest concerns with turnaround times. That's what we're doing most of our focus. Planning's looking pretty good, but we're still making sure that those are operating pretty well as well. And so what we're seeing, if you go to the next slide, are some improvements. So these are basically the three permit types that most people are interested in right now. The top one is a single family dwelling, and this is average days to complete the first review cycle. The next one down is the same thing, first review cycle for new construction for building permits for commercial building permits. And then this is for first review cycle for our tier 3 infrastructure engineering permits. And these are like big infrastructure, like brand new streets with subdivisions or frontage improvements on for a large commercial building. So our top one, our goal is 35 days for that. As you can see, not so well back here. Really doing well. We're down to 26 days, so we're hitting that 35 days. Some of this has to do with volume. Our volumes do increase during the winter, so we're realizing some of that. But I think through those initiatives that we're putting into place right now, when we come back into our normal seasonal fluctuation, we start to get more, we're going to be better poised to hit those. Same thing here. This one, our goal is 90 days for this one. As you can see, pretty concerning up through here, over 100 days. The first review, we're down to 75 meeting our goal there. And our tier 3, the goal here is 45 days, exceeding that through over the holiday period, but we're down. Actually, that's a pretty good turnaround. So they're almost 30 days for a 45-day goal. And that, I believe, is my last slide. No, I do have another one. Next steps. So today is the very top, present to the regular meeting on April the 3rd, and we'll be happy to come back on the 17th to continue this discussion when more of your members are available. I'm going to give my the same presentation to my department tomorrow morning in this room at 8 o'clock. I will present to COBA on the 11th at our meeting next week with them. And then Affordable Housing Committee will be on April the 12th. And then quarterly update to the City Council on April the 19th. That'll be mostly talking about our turnaround times, but I will be talking obviously about the budget as well. And then we go into the budget deliberations in May, from the 22nd to 23rd, council adoption, 21st of June, and then effective date July 1. That's all I have. Any questions? No.
Are you repeating this in your sleep?
Good. It certainly makes it easier.
Well, in a couple of weeks. Great. Well, thanks a lot, Colin.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Pretty good. Questions? Okay. Next agenda item, there's no Kevney here unless he's online.
I do not see him online. I mean, maybe just to wrap this up, especially if anyone's watching that joined late, we're going to kind of bring this back for a discussion with the full BDAB on the 17th, figure out what your feedback is going to be at that time. All of you have seen this presentation at least once. Most of you have seen it twice at this point. So can also bring some feedback on how the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee responds to this as well at that meeting, and kind of figure out from there where things stand. But if you have questions in the meantime or things you want answered, Colin, Russ, Jeanette, Teresa, we'll all be back on the 17th. And we'll try to make that just an hour kind of discussion, more deliberative than, yeah, John.
Thanks.
Only if you come up to the mic. No, you got to come up to the mic. So.
Real quickly, I understand first presentation that the city made on the permitting was with COBA before the advocacy meeting with the BDAB, is that right?
With a group of developers, just to kind of get
Gotcha.
their feedback.
Is
So
that, what was that feedback?
Gary and Jim were both there.
Yeah,
So
I mean, that seems like a pretty heavy, important voice in the process. Also, the other kind of unrelated to this, I see some good marketing. You mentioned PR elements to this, which are important. There, having seen this presentation twice now, there are some really valuable data points on that later in the presentation that I think will help you a lot that I didn't notice the first time. I mean, I'm sure you've already doing that, but I think there are some safer arguments to the increase in that data. But anyway, I'm interested in what COPA said.
So not COBA. So Colin's talking to
development.
COBA next week. This was, I mean, COBA, Morgan was there at the meeting as well, that first one. But Jim and Gary, any feedback? I mean, I could.
Yeah, I mean, I think none other than what we've heard today. I mean, a lot of the comments have been repeated. I think some of it is being addressed, and I expect over the next month we'll get, continue to get more support. I mean, again, I think our goal, the developers, is really just to have a clear understanding of what the numbers are and where they come from. I think it's, from a business perspective, it's easy to get on board when we understand the details of it, regardless of the reason why, right? I mean, when costs are exceeding the money that you're bringing in, it's never good for anybody. So, if our city is going to continue to function the way that we need it to function, these things are necessary. We just, I think, want more transparency is kind of the bottom line is we see some gaps in the numbers and just want those items clarified.
Okay.
So I'll send out a follow-up with the recording of this, the slide deck. Try to get the folks that aren't here to watch this on YouTube. And like I said, if folks have questions, we'll try to kind of collect them, aggregate. I can't think right now. We'll get them all on the list. Put them
I'll
on the
make it
list. We
happen.
can talk about them on the 17th.
So can't watch that newest episode of Mandalorian. You got to watch the Colin on YouTube.
Yes.
the assignment?
Yeah, that's must see.
All right. So I assume we're tabling Kevney.
Yeah, so I mean, I can give a very brief update here, and then I think we'll talk more about this in May. So this another budget issue. Visit Bend comes before BDAB every year before going to council. Back in 2017, created a rainy day fund for Visit Bend, or really using their existing funds with the goal that it sideline a little bit of funding every year, and then if there was a big change to market conditions, they could pull those funds. So different from their reserve fund, this was really for, they needed to ramp up marketing or investment in tourism related facilities. And this probably does pair better with a bigger presentation from Visit Bend, because what's happened in the tourism industry has been interesting. Hasn't been a cataclysmic change, but I think as Kevney alluded to a couple of months ago, indexing our years off 2021 and 2022 for tourism visitation to Bend probably doesn't make sense going forward. Those are kind of an aberration for a lot of mountain towns, but we're back on like the 2019 trajectory. So they're accessing a small portion, I want to say 20 or 30% of the rainy day fund to pump up some funding into some of their grant programs, mostly that have kind of dipped in terms of due to the lack of expected funds over the last year, which is exactly how the rainy day fund was conceived, right? This is how it's going to work. But I won't try to get Kevney on the call just for a quick update, knowing we're pretty tight on time, and they'll talk more about it then.
Okay.
And then you want me to just keep running through these, Keith?
Yeah, it's all
'Cause
you.
they're all me. So the
Go.
STC working group with Travis gone today, that Don has been participating as well. I think we'll just try to have a brief update from both of you on the 17th, if that works. Business advocacy budget, I am looking for 2 or 3 BDAB members or ex officios to participate in 1, maybe 2 1-hour calls in the next month. We'll set them up like the strategic plan calls so we can do them via Zoom. be public meetings. But as was alluded to today, we do need to look at increasing the business registration fee, which is a license. Currently, it's 50 for new members, 75 or 50 for existing registrants, 75 for new registrants in that first year. And we're not looking at a huge increase. Actual staff load costs on the fund are pretty light. It's me and then a little bit of the admin fund for CEDD. But we're seeing general fund support decrease over time. This has been a trend for years. At the same time, EDCO, I think, has done some really good work around making sure that they're actually paying salaries to their staff that match market conditions. So how do we accommodate for a reduction in the general fund subsidy and at the same time try to kind of maintain our support of the EDCO contract? So we're going to talk a little bit through some scenarios and then just look at the business advocacy budget, which is incredibly simple. It's the business advocate, it's the EDCO contract, and then whatever events I go to every year. That's about it. So, and then we'll bring that back in May for a discussion with BDAB, but wanted to kind of run through a couple scenarios. So if that jumps out to anyone, Keith, I think you've participated in those in the past. Pretty simple budget. And I'll send out an email because again, we only have 5 of the 9 members here. And then final one, strategic plan. We were going to have a vote today to create a natural strategic plan working group. We'll hold off on that too. But we have, I think, 5 members, 4 or 5 members participating right now. Don, Keith, Travis, Tierney, and Kelly. That group's going to meet once a month for the next 6 months. And really, we want to have BDAB actually vote on creating a subcommittee. So then we'll have members that can participate beyond on that subcommittee beyond their terming off, and we'll have some good balance as we kind of try to wrap that up. So, and then we're going to try to schedule a kickoff discussion with Damon Runberg and Josh Lehner last week in April, first week in May, in this room, hour and a half. Partner organizations, other committees, counselors will all be invited as well to kind of talk about what are the market conditions right now and get everyone on the same page. So I just ran through all those in like 5 minutes, but
Perfect.
if anyone has questions, let me know.
Yeah, the only other thing is a roundtable. Is there anything that any members want to bring up here before we adjourn? Excellent. We are adjourned.
Kevin did.
Oh,
Right.
Kevin.
Just to adjourn, Kevin, or?
Nope, I have nothing.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Thank you.